Welcome to Functional Philosophy, the show in which I, Charles II, explain and apply Ayn Rand's philosophy, Objectivism. If you'd like to ask me a question on Objectivism or its application, just go to charles2.com/contact. And my last name is spelled T as in tango, E as in echo, and W as in whiskey. I was watching a live stream with Yaron Brook, Onkar Ghate, and Gregory Salmieri about the Jordan Peterson panel at OCON. Yaron said the following in the chat, quote, "Happiness is far from self-evident," unquote. That really threw me for a loop. Isn't happiness self-evident? It's simply irreducible that happiness is desirable. You can't get underneath the fact that happiness makes you happy. It's the foundation of ethics. There's no proof, quote-unquote. Am I missing something here? Yes, you are, but let's start from the top here with this quote. Happiness is far from self-evident. I don't know what that means. Does this mean the existence of the emotional, conscious state we refer to as happiness is far from self-evident? Does it mean the means by which you achieve happiness is far from self-evident? Does it mean that you should pursue happiness is far from self-evident? Well, I assume this last, but let's go over the first two just in case. Is the existence of happiness self-evident? Well, it's self-evident like most things are self-evident. The existence of the desk in front of me is self-evident. But you have to be in a place where you can see it with your eyeballs for that to mean anything, for it to be self-evident to you. So self-evident doesn't mean axiomatic, certainly not philosophically axiomatic. The table in front of me is self-evident, but it's not the same thing as existence exists, which you know is true no matter what form your awareness takes. Or where you are. No matter where you are or what your context, if you are conscious, you are aware that something exists. Now, that's not true of the table in front of me. From the perspective of most places in the universe, it is not self-evident that this table exists because you can't see it. So happiness is like that. It is an emotional state that you experience firsthand, and in that sense is self-evident, but it's not something you're aware of in every context. A child is not aware that such a state exists. Many adults aren't aware. So if what he means is that the existence of such an exalted state as happiness is not known to most people, then I agree. And obviously, if the existence of an emotional state is not known by most people, then the means by which one brings it about is also not known by most people. Now, from this, you can infer that most people don't know that the pursuit of happiness should be their number one priority. However, I'm being technical here. Happiness is a specific conscious state. What is self-evident, and self-evident in the sense that people are aware of this at practically every point in their lives, including probably in the womb before birth, is that pleasure is good. Now, unfortunately, I'm not aware of any concept that integrates abstract experiences such as happiness and physical pleasure. I usually refer to all of those collectively as good feelings, although that has a connotation of short-term pleasure to somebody who is not familiar with the specific way I'm speaking. You might call these positive states of consciousness or states of consciousness with positive valence, but now you know what I mean. That positive states of consciousness are the only reason to do anything is obvious to every human being capable of feeling pleasure before he is even conceptual. He knows it implicitly before that point. Now, the knowledge of the specific state called happiness comes only after one has acted in the world, specifically in a productive context. Only after one has engaged in a process over a period of time of sustaining his life through reason. A child is unaware that such a state as happiness exists because he does not yet exist in a context where he has to use reason to survive, a normal child anyway, assuming he's being taken care of by his parents. He and adults who have not acted rationally may have some premonitory knowledge of the existence of such a state as happiness. You know how you feel when you anticipate something, even if you haven't had it yet? Like before you're in a relationship with a member of the opposite sex. You don't know exactly how it's going to feel when you are, but you still want that, and you kind of do know how it's going to feel. You can project what it will feel like, even though you haven't yet felt it. It's like imagining pain. Well, you can remember what pain feels like, right? Even though remembering that isn't actually feeling it. So it's a strange thing, but in two different senses, you can kind of know that a state exists without actually having experienced it. Because I suppose you've kind of experienced its opposite, or you can use your imagination, engage in a fantasy, not irrationally, but you can imagine something and your mind will produce kind of a sample of the experience. It's not as if people rationally sustain their lives and go to work arbitrarily and they expect no rewards in the form of positive states of consciousness. But that doesn't mean that they fully know what happiness will feel like before they've experienced it. So anyway, the way I interpret what you have quoted Yaron as saying is that if people aren't pursuing their own conscious well-being, it's not because they're immoral necessarily. It's not because they're dishonest necessarily. People can be honestly confused about this. Well, I disagree. I believe you can be confused about it, but only dishonestly. If you want to know the relationship between honesty and stupidity, I suggest you look up one of my older episodes where I explain how these things are not alternatives but relate to each other. So no, if we are taking this colloquially, happiness is far from self-evident, if we are taking that to mean it's not obvious to people that they should pursue what makes them feel good, even in a long-term rational way, not hedonism, but that they should pursue what will ultimately make them happy, or feel good, or redound to their own conscious well-being. That's not obvious. People are just confused. Well, this is a big difference between Yaron and me. I don't believe people are honestly confused about this. It is self-evident that pleasure, at least, is good, even if you're unaware of any higher form or state of consciousness. And so to ignore the pursuit of that as your motivation and to follow some other guide not in the sense of this is what you have to do to ultimately feel the best, but other guide in the sense of some other ultimate end, is dishonest. There is no evidence for it. Believing such a thing must be dishonest because it is arbitrary. It's like believing in altruism. That is dishonest. Somewhere on some level, it is dishonest. Somewhere you have accepted a premise on the basis of nothing, because there is nothing that can justify altruism. Following some tortuous argument that you should sacrifice for the greater good rather than pursue the self-evident good that is pleasure is dishonest. However, it is a mistake to say, as you do, that happiness is the foundation of ethics. It is not the foundation of ethics. I do think that good feelings are an axiom of ethics. There's no reason to do anything unless it feels good. And in fact, the vast majority of ethical discussion recognizes this. Even religious people talk about the bliss that existence in heaven with God will be, and talk about sacrifice for the purpose of making other people feel good, or at least feel less bad. Most ethical discussion terminates in the experience of some consciousness somewhere. And that is because the desirability of positive states of consciousness is an axiom. It is actually incoherent to talk about ethics to talk about the question of what should guide your action without positing some end. And the only end that needs no justification is pleasure and the more sophisticated forms of feeling good. However, that does not make happiness the foundation of ethics. Happiness exists as the reward for taking action to sustain your life. The existence of good feelings depends metaphysically on the existence of life. So life, in that sense, is the foundation of ethics. That's not to say that life is intrinsically valuable. If it didn't feel good to live, there would be no reason to sustain your life. Nonetheless, without life, there is no feeling good. Look, organisms exist, and eventually, such organisms developed as needed consciousness to direct their actions in the world for the survival of the organism. But a consciousness has no motivation to act unless it feels good to act. So pleasure, happiness, that's the payment for the job. You can think of yourself as a consciousness who has been made a job offer. Keep this physical system alive, and you will be paid in good feelings. Now, the only reason you're doing it, then, the only reason you're taking action to sustain this body of yours is because it feels good to do so. However, you also have to recognize that there is no job offer if there is no life to sustain. So don't make the mistake of thinking otherwise and find yourself creeping toward hedonism. Hedonism is wrong, but that doesn't mean it's not obvious to everyone that the possibility of achieving positive states of consciousness is the only reason to do anything. Next question. I have been watching your videos and I want to thank you for sharing your ability to explain philosophy and to identify errors and false premises. I have never seen someone able to articulate objectivism in a way that shows such a deep and thorough understanding of the philosophy outside of a few of the best thinkers at ARI. Onkar, Greg Salmieri, Harry Binswanger, and Leonard Peikoff. I find it rather astonishing that you are on par with these highly trained professionals, especially since you appear to be under 30 years old. Is there anything in particular as far as your thought/learning process that has allowed you to advance so rapidly? Any particular material or mental habit? P.S. I really want to encourage you to keep up what you are doing and not to sell yourself short. You can be a marvelously successful philosopher even today. Well, I wish I agreed with you on that last part. I agree in the sense that I think I can be a great philosopher, but not in the sense that I believe I can achieve great existential success, which is what I believe you are trying to say. And I don't sell myself short. I sell the world short. Now, it may seem self-aggrandizing that I'm taking this question, but I took it only because I have an actual answer, a substantial one that you may find valuable. It is true that I'm under 30, by the way, for a little while longer, at least. Now, how have I achieved my level of intellectual sophistication at such a young age? Well, I hope my basic answer doesn't surprise you. I am the way I am because I have been honest. That is my particular thought or learning process. That is my secret. Now, all I can do here is give you a few examples of how dishonesty leads to stupidity, and hopefully thereby make the connection clear. Let's take writing, for example, which is a manifestation of thinking. Let's take a specific form of bad writing. You often see in bad writing people using $5 words inappropriately. Now, why do they do this? I'm not saying there's no conceivable, honest, though mistaken reason you might use a big, fancy-sounding word when you shouldn't, but often, big words are not used for honest reasons. Often, big words are used because the writer has given his mind the order not to send him the words that will convey the idea he's trying to express most clearly, but to send him words that will make him sound smart to other people. Now, this affects the way you think. If you are second-handed, which is a moral issue, then you are telling your mind to think less efficiently, irrationally, for the purpose of impressing other people. You have undercut your thought process with immorality. Even the desire to learn depends on honesty. You won't do what I have done unless you have honestly maintained the conviction that ideas matter, that abstractions relate to the real world. If you don't do that, if you say, I don't care what the truth is, I'm just going to go along with what other people say, well, then you are going to be unable to maintain the interest required to develop yourself intellectually. If you have decided that the means by which you are going to pursue values is going to be to fake reality, which is what dishonesty means, then discovering the truth just isn't going to excite you that much. The truth is titillating only if you hold the premise that you live in the world of truth, of fact, and that therefore, if you are going to achieve your values, you have to adhere strictly to what's true. If you have thrown that out because you're going to pretend, and you're going to listen to other people, and you're going to use words you don't understand as if you do understand them, in short, if you have thrown out truth as your guide, then you are going to be unable to generate excitement at discovering truth. This is why people who like the idea of being an intellectual are very often stupid. You might think, well, why couldn't this person actually like being an intellectual, but also just want to impress people? Because those two things are at odds. If you like the idea of being an intellectual in order to impress people, then you don't like searching for the intellectual truth. People are mixed, of course. There are many mixtures here. I'm not saying everyone who's second-handed has no vestige of personal values and interest. You can think of Keating with his painting, for instance. But to the extent you are second-handed, you don't care about the truth. So it is only by being honest and scrupulously committed to the facts that you can maintain an interest in philosophy. Why are most people uninterested in philosophy? Why do their eyes glaze over 3 seconds after you start talking about anything epistemological or metaphysical, even without jargon? It's because they don't think it matters. It doesn't relate to the real world, at least the real world as they conceive it, which means the fantasy they've chosen, not the real world. Here's another example. Introspection. Now, philosophy is the study of man's relationship to existence. Man as a conscious, rational being. So if you give up the man side of that equation, that's half of the subject. And that is precisely what dishonest people do. Dishonest people are fearful of introspection because they are afraid of identifying their own motives. They don't want to look inside and see that they are motivated by envy or have allowed themselves to act on the basis of envy. They evade that. But in the narrowest possible example, psychological understanding depends on introspecting about your own emotions and where they come from. A great deal of philosophical understanding depends on that. If you are afraid of identifying what's going on in your own mind, then you are afraid of half of philosophy. Now, I think this is one major difference between myself and other people. I am scrupulously honest, not even with other people primarily, but with myself about my own motives and emotions. Very few people are, and as a result, don't do a lot of introspecting. This applies more widely than just in the realm of introspection. All of truth. Everything is connected. So if you are irrational or immoral, evasive about one thing, that will ultimately lead to what Peikoff calls conceptual blackout. If you are evasive, you are refusing to look at the truth. But all truth is connected, and so you are blinding yourself to other facts of reality. It's really as simple as this. What is the primary virtue according to Objectivism. Rationality, there you go. Epistemology, ethics, reason, virtue, understanding, and morality. So that's it. The only difference between me and other people is that I am honest, and they are not. This is what Ayn Rand believed about herself, by the way. She thought the only difference between her and everyone else was that she was honest, and I agree. Now, you may find it scary for me to hold you to the standard of Ayn Rand, the world's greatest genius, but I do hold you and myself to that standard. If you are motivated by values, you will find that liberating. If you are motivated by fear, then you will find it anxiety-inducing. Next question. Steven Pinker's latest book, Enlightenment Now, was released a few months ago. Since its release, there has been some discussion about resurrecting or perhaps preserving Enlightenment ideas. However, one notable criticism of the Enlightenment, mainly from conservatives like Ben Shapiro, is the failure of the French Revolution, which we know resulted in replacing the French monarchy with a secular dictatorship before collapsing into the dictatorship of Napoleon Bonaparte. My question is, why did the Enlightenment work in America but fail in France? Conservatives like to claim that it was religion, notably Christianity, that grounded the Enlightenment in America. Well, there is a sense in which that last part is true. God's intellectual function is to serve as a consolidation of contradiction. When faced with a seemingly irresolvable contradiction, such as that the universe must be both finite and infinite, people often find it valuable to be able to avoid relitigating the issue of contradiction every time it comes up. So whenever they find something like this, they say, throw it in the God bin. That's where we put everything that doesn't make sense. God is the one contradiction we will allow at the base of all existence. And then every time we find something we can't resolve, we just say God. So we can avoid having the discussion of how a contradiction is possible. We've already acknowledged that they are. That's the domain of God. Now, Enlightenment thinkers, including the American founding fathers, used God this way, namely for the justification of individual rights. So you can say that religion in that way plugged the gaps that existed in Enlightenment thinking. However, that does not mean religion is true or even valuable in a more sophisticated context. It is probably true that religion was required by our most primitive ancestors for them to be able to have some pseudo-grasp of the world around them, for them to organize their action on some basis, and thereby survive. However, when you discover that there is a rational way to think about the world, thinking about it in a supernatural and mystical way is irrational. It serves no purpose. It has no silver lining. If somebody offers you a choice between having $1, $3, or $5, all things equal, the rational choice is to choose $5. There is no reason to choose $3. Now, a defender of $3 might say, but look, $3 is better than $1, and that's true. But in this context, there is no reason to choose $3. And so the proper perspective on choosing $3 is not that you gained $2 more than you would have if you chose 1, but that you lost $2 more than you would have if you chose 5. So we can say that religious societies do better than skeptical ones, that wrong answers are better than no answers, but right answers are better than wrong answers, and we don't need any mix of right and wrong answers. But now let's get to the actual relationship between the Enlightenment and France and America, respectively. Asking why the Enlightenment worked in America but didn't in France is like asking, why did Greek thought work in the Renaissance but not in the Dark Ages? We got out of the Dark Ages thanks to Aristotle, but the Dark Ages themselves were the legacy of Plato, who was also a Greek. Well, the way you explain this is obvious. We are talking about a broad segment of history. We are talking about a place whose thinkers at a certain time shared a basic philosophical approach. Obviously, in any broad group, you are going to have people who expressed the basic premises of their age more consistently and less consistently. You wouldn't take every single Greek philosopher as an exemplar of Greek thought. You would say, oh, Aristotle represents the apotheosis of the basic approach of Greek philosophy. Whereas Plato, though he shared this basic approach, came in his ultimate conclusions to oppose that very approach. Now you can say exactly the same thing about the Enlightenment. John Locke and the American Founding Fathers represent a more consistent expression of the basic ideas of the Enlightenment, whereas Rousseau and French politics at the time represented a less consistent expression of Enlightenment ideas. Isn't it ironic that this conservative Ben Shapiro suddenly becomes egalitarian when it comes to this question? Who can say who really represents the Enlightenment? Locke, Rousseau, America, France. All we know is that we classify them all under the Enlightenment, and so therefore we can make no distinctions. Well, it's probably a waste of time for me to even be answering this question because no one rational buys that argument. I would never argue that religion is bad because someone who claimed to be religious did a bad thing. I would argue that religion is bad because you can draw a cause and effect relationship between the ideas of religion and the actions of people who hold those ideas. This is so stupid and dishonest. This is the relationship between falsehood and skepticism. This is an example of it. Ben Shapiro knows his argument has no leg to stand on, or at least he fears it has no leg to stand on. And so he preaches egalitarianism and skepticism here. Oh, who can say what causes what? All we can say is we have this broad classification, and so anybody is equally representative. I mean, would he say anybody who takes the name of a Christian is equally representative of Christianity? Or any Jew is representative of Judaism? I mean, this isn't even plausible on its face. Ideas have logical implications, and we are capable of recognizing when somebody is following those implications and when he isn't. And so we don't have to rely on the method of treating everyone who existed at any time in history as representative of that period of history. We can identify that the political consequence of the premises of naturalism and the efficacy of reason is freedom. We can see how the ideas that this world is real and that reason can ascertain the truth leads to America and not France. France at that time anyway. But it is true, you can say that France still had some element of the Enlightenment within it, in the same way that Plato had some element of the basic Greek approach in him. And as a result, you will notice that despite the relative failure of France at the time, France is today one of the best places to live on Earth, as are all Western countries, because they have been touched by the Enlightenment. So you can zoom in and be dishonestly myopic and disintegrated about this, or you can look at the big picture and notice that despite the French Revolution, which was not a manifestation of the basic ideas of the Enlightenment still existed in France in some form, and as a result, today, it is one of the relatively free Western countries. In fact, you will see that what distinguishes the Western world from the rest of the world is that it is less religious, and that includes America. Yes, America is more religious than Europe, but America is nowhere near as religious as the worst places on earth, such as the Middle East, where people take religion seriously. So the answer to your question is that the Enlightenment worked in America because the Founding Fathers actually believed in the basic principles of the Enlightenment, and it failed in France because they contradicted those basic principles. I've heard Ben Shapiro talk about this before. He says, oh, well, people say the Enlightenment's so good, but Rousseau was part of the Enlightenment, so you have to take responsibility for him. Okay, well, the next time some religious person does something awful, I don't want to hear Ben Shapiro say, well, he's obviously acting in contradiction to the religion. If you actually understand what the religion says, then it doesn't say to go murder all these people. No. We have thrown that out. All we can go on is the broad classification. How can we say, this guy said he's religious? Maybe this other guy who gives to charity says he's religious, but they both say they're religious, so how can we distinguish? This is just a stupid and dishonest argument. And it's why I consider Ben Shapiro a fake intellectual. People think he's smart because he's so fast talking, but I think the function of that fast talking is actually to overwhelm you with a rapid succession of nonsense before you realize how stupid any one thing he's saying is.
If you'd like to keep up with everything I do, just go to charles2.com. If you'd like to enable me to do more, just go to patreon.com/charles2 and become a supporter. Thanks for listening.